Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Luke Wybranczyk, and today, as you can see, by some stroke of luck, I managed to get on my podcast some of the, well, in my opinion, one of the best ethicists in the world currently. Thank you for coming here. My guests today are Dr. Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek and Professor Peter Singer. Hello and welcome. It's an honor to have you here.
Hello, thank you for the invitation.
Just to introduce my guests briefly, Dr. Katarzyna, she is a philosopher and ethicist teaching at the University of Łódź. In her writing, she touches upon such subjects as bioethics, as animal ethics, metaethics. A book of yours has been published this year. In Polish, it's called Godny pożądania, stan świadomości. Could you please tell us a few words about that?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you. It's the book, the English title would be The Desirable Consciousness, Pleasure as the Ultimate Value. The title I borrowed from Henry Sidgwick, from his description of pleasure. And the Polish book is on well-being. What are the theories of well-being? What's the definition of the notion? And on pleasure, what is pleasure? What are there any kinds of pleasures, and so on and so forth.
Right. And my second guest is Professor Peter Singer. In my view, the most important thinker on the subject of animal ethics, the single speaker who changed my mind on this issue. I certainly recommend his books such as Animal Liberation, and recently there's this new book called Why Vegan that you wrote. I definitely recommend that. Peter has this amazing ability, in my view, of making simple arguments, very convincing arguments, which imply conclusions about our life, that we should radically change our lives. This is something I very much value about your work. Also, you've written extensively on the subject of effective altruism and charitable giving. The place to start your adventure with Peter Singer on that subject would be The Life You Can Save, in my opinion. This has recently become public, right? Basically, the book, The Life You Can Save, is now available to everyone for free.
That's correct. We bought the rights back. When I say we, I mean the charity that I founded called The Life You Can Save, bought the rights back from the American and Australian publishers. So the English language edition is available on the website of The Life You Can Save. You can download it free as an ebook, or if you prefer to listen to audiobooks, we have an audiobook where each chapter was read by a celebrity who donated their time, including people like Kristen Bell, Paul Simon, Stephen Fry. You get a lot of different voices and different accents reading chapters.
Right. Much of these actors are starring on the series The Good Place. Also, I've noticed, I'm a fan of the series, and I noticed that in one of the episodes, they show the most moral person on Earth. And actually, he's reading this book, the most good you can do.
The most good you can do, right, yes. Right. That's great, very nice, yes. But you're right, the people on that cast have been very supportive of The Life You Can Save, which is nice too.
Yeah, so I definitely recommend that. If you would prefer to read that in Polish, there's a Polish translation of that. And I noticed that the translator, the person who translated the Life You Can Save, is called Elżbieta de Lazari. So I'm wondering, is that...
It's my mother.
Right, that makes sense. That explains everything. And she also translated the book about animal ethics, Ethics of What We Eat. I think that's the title, right? Yeah. And of course, it's not a coincidence that I have you two here. You have collaborated, you've co-authored many books, two of which I have here. Here's The Point of View of the Universe, a commentary on the work of Henry Sidgwick. It touches upon a lot of different issues. And here's I definitely recommend that one. And here's a very short introduction to utilitarianism. To anyone who's starting out, trying to understand this subject and this approach to ethics, I definitely recommend that. So thank you for that. And also, I think you're planning to release a new one. You're just working on a new book together. Is that correct?
You're probably thinking about our edited edition of John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. Is that right?
Yes.
That actually has just appeared in the last week or so.
Oh.
It came out, I think, August the 1st was the publication date. Yeah, so it's an edition of this famous text, which is regarded as one of the most widely read defenses of utilitarianism. But we do make quite a few comments on it along the way, and they're not all favorable to John Stuart Mill, because as you might have gathered from the title of Katarzyna's book, we both actually really think that Henry Sidgwick is a better philosopher than Mill.
Right.
Of course, he's not so easy to read, and his book, The Methods of Ethics, is 500 pages, whereas Mill's essay, Utilitarianism, is very short. But Mill's not always the very most careful and accurate philosopher in his arguments.
Yes, that's something you underscore in some of your work, that really Sidgwick is the first scholar. He really has a systematic approach, really careful and diligent to spell out what he has in mind. Focusing on our subject now, I invited you here to talk about abortion. The reason for that might be obvious for people living in Poland. We recently, believe it or not, the abortion law has just become even stricter than it already was, allowing for only two conditions under which an abortion can be performed. That is, if there's a high probability of a threat to the mother's life or health, or in case of rape or incest. All sorts of disabilities of the embryo or the fetus, they never play a role, really. That's the law currently in Poland, so that's fairly disturbing. So I decided to invite you here and sort of to ask you to get some help on figuring out a rational view on abortion that we can have. And maybe let's start there. I reviewed much of the pro-life argumentation before our interview, and I actually noticed that one of the main tactics that they are trying to achieve often is to focus the attention, sort of force the interlocutor to focus on what they deem as the central question, and that's what is the unborn. And I think that here's a question directed to you, Professor Singer. I think that you broadly agree with that approach, to figure out the approach is to figure out what capacities, what characteristics does the fetus and the embryo, the newborn have, and depending on these characteristics, we should make the judgment of what moral standing, what moral status the fetus has. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, that's my view. But in particular, I object to the view, which is often the center point of debate between pro-life people and those who are in favor of liberal abortion laws. I don't think it should be whether the fetus is a human being. That seems to me to be not the crucial issue. And I'm prepared to grant that the fetus is a human being. The fetus of human parents has to be human, in terms of its genetics, clearly. And it is alive also, in a biological sense. It's definitely alive. So I want to get away from this argument that, well, the fetus is a human being or the fetus is not a human being. I think, in fact, the pro-life people can win that argument. But what we really need to get to is what are the capacities or characteristics that make it wrong to kill a being? And I don't think just being a member of a certain species is enough to do that. I think it has to be something else. And that's what we need to look at the fetus and try and say, does the fetus have these capacities or characteristics that make a being someone with moral status, that it's wrong to harm them in certain ways, to cause them to suffer, for example, or perhaps to kill them.
Right. From the utilitarian perspective, typically what is understood is that pain and pleasure are supposed to play the main role. And it seems to me that in order to experience any pleasure or any pain, one would need consciousness. And
that's correct, yes.
Right.
Yes,
And,
that's a view that I share.
right. And then, of course, there's this question of when exactly. I mean, and so there's this, this progression of development of the fetus, and at some point, it has to gain the ability to experience pain because we do, and we are human. So it has to happen somewhere in there. But there's definitely a spot, a place, or a period in time where it doesn't feel any pleasure or pain. So I think the question would be, where do we draw the line, or maybe recognize the line?
Yes, and drawing lines is always difficult to do in a precise way when you have a gradual process of development. But scientists who've studied the development of the embryo and fetus tend to agree that it could not be earlier than 20 weeks after conception in terms of when the nervous system and the brain is developed and starting to function. And some think that it's actually quite a bit later than that it's more like 28 weeks perhaps before you've really got good evidence of consciousness. But, perhaps there's a gray area somewhere between 20 weeks and 28 weeks or somewhere around there where we could say we're not sure and we should try to give the fetus the benefit of the doubt and assume that it may feel pain at that stage.
Right. And when we have this number in mind, at 20 weeks or so, I think it's also worth considering the data on when most abortions are actually performed, right? When they are done, because it actually falls within that range. It's very rare to have an abortion later than that, as far as I understand. Is that correct?
That is correct. The vast majority of abortions are performed not later than about 12 weeks, so well before the point at which it's plausible to believe that the fetus is conscious. There are occasionally some abortions performed later. There are surprising cases where a woman doesn't actually know that she's pregnant until quite late. That will seem strange to many women who've been pregnant, that you could not know about it for so long, but it does occasionally happen. Or it may be that, and as you said, this is not allowed now in the law in Poland, but it may be that a serious abnormality is detected only quite late in pregnancy.
Right.
And a woman may want to terminate the pregnancy for that reason.
Yes. Turning now to you, Dr. Katarzyna, often when one hears somebody argue against the pro-life side, they appeal to personhood, stating that really the fetus shouldn't be considered on a par with us, as the pro-life crowd or the conservative people would like to suggest, because it isn't a person. Now, I think, and utilitarians sometimes do this as well, and I think that's a good tactic for actually refuting some of the pro-life arguments. But I think that, strictly speaking, a utilitarian shouldn't actually put an extreme amount of weight on appeals to personhood, because, of course, we do count animals into our circle of compassion, and most of them are not persons. So what role does personhood play here? To what extent does it matter?
So first of all, I think that now the word personhood is a bit misused, right? Because, as you said, I mean, if we understand it only as a human being, really, then clearly from Locke on, or maybe even earlier, we didn't think of persons only as humans. Person is someone who has certain features, yes, capabilities, certain attributes. And the philosophical discussion is usually concentrated on the question what those attributes should be to call someone a person.
Right.
But again, as you pointed out, especially in the conservative circles, the word is used usually for human beings, yes, for people.
Right.
I often teach that to my own students, that if we use the word in Polish, it's osoba, right, a person. We don't necessarily take that to be a human being, yes, Homo sapiens,
right,
a member of the species. But I personally believe that we can skip the discussion who the person really is, whether it's a conscious being or it's a self-conscious being, whether it's a reasonable being, for example. But we should concentrate the discussion on the moral status. Yes, so which of the beings that are on our planet have moral status? For example, to whom we owe something, as some philosophers would say. Yes. So it's a subject of our obligations.
Right.
And I think that shows clearly that it's a much wider group, because obviously we want to include animals, vertebrates for sure. Yes, if we believe that they feel pain and pleasure to be in this group of moral beings. But maybe even further. Yes, maybe the group should be even bigger and include other animals.
Touching upon this this issue of moral standing, so it seems to me that if a being is a person, that does raise her moral standing or his moral standing, but it isn't a necessary component of us treating that being in moral terms, it's being a moral patient, right? Using the philosophical terminology. Would that be right?
I would certainly agree with that. I think that you could say that moral persons, if we use that term to mean beings who are rational and self-aware, that they are moral agents in the sense that they can be held responsible for the choices they make. Mm-hmm. But there would certainly be some animals who we would not regard as moral agents, just as we don't regard an infant as a moral agent, for example. Mm. But we would say that they're moral patients, meaning by that, as Katarzyna just said, that there are things we owe them and that there are things that it would be wrong to do to them. And that would obviously include gratuitously inflicting pain on them. It would be something that would be wrong to do both to a human infant and to those non-human animals, which we might agree are not persons, but are capable of feeling pain.
Dr. Katarzyna, maybe you would like to also comment on that, because now I'm wondering, should we treat a person's interests, let's say, because, you know, a cow, a chicken, we might in some sense say that they have their interest to continue their life, maybe to, you know, experience pleasure and so on. Should we count the interests of a person higher, in your view? Or is it just on a par, but maybe somebody could say that a person has the greater potential to experience pleasure and pain? Or maybe not. What's your view on that?
First of all, I mean, it's still being discovered on scientific level, yes? How to measure pain and pleasure of other animals, if it's such a subjective experience. We don't know even what we humans, other humans, experience really, because we know only our feelings. So there is only an analogy that we can draw from what we know and what we experience. But if I wonder what's the moral standing and what's really important, or what's the value from a moral perspective, whom I should count, yes, whom I should care for, then I believe that the notion of a person doesn't add anything special. Peter said, of course, that there is this difference between that who think of a moral law, for example, yes, so who can think of our obligations. But in most of the most important moral discussions, I believe that we need to settle to whom we have those obligations. Yes, rather
who is capable of thinking in moral terms, for example, right? Okay, and now I'd like to pose a question to Peter Singer. So many people, and this is a controversial issue which Christians typically want to catch you on that, score some points, and that's the moral standing of the newborn. So many people have the intuition that really a newborn child has the same moral status as an adult, or as any adult. So my question is simply, is this intuition wrong?
Well, I think it's wrong to some extent, yes. Obviously, as we've been saying, in terms of capacity to feel pain or pleasure, the newborn does have those capacities. And certainly the newborn has a moral status, which, as I just said, would make it wrong to inflict pain for no overriding reason. But I think that if we're talking about ending a life, perhaps it is relevant whether a being is capable of seeing his or her life as something that they're living and something that they are wanting to do and are hoping to do. And maybe that makes a difference in terms of the wrongness of killing. Mm-hmm. Certainly, it will make a difference in terms of how people are affected by a killing, how third parties are affected. So when we are living in a place where the crime rate is very high and where we hear about people being murdered, then we are going to be in fear of our own lives, and we will live very differently. We will have much more security, or not go out at night, or do other things to protect ourselves. So that means that we're beings with the capacity to actually be harmed by someone else being killed, not by being killed ourselves, but it changes the way we live.
Right.
And I think that's relevant. But if we're talking about infants, obviously an infant is not capable of being aware of what is happening to other infants, or being frightened by that. So, that's at least one difference. You might think that it's just a sort of external factor, that it's not going to the heart of the question. But it's the kind of factor that I think we can properly take into account in considering when killing might be defensible and when it might not be, for whatever reasons.
Right.
I would add something to that, because
mm-hmm.
that's a good example of why the notion of person may bring more problems. If we call a fetus a person, for example, and it's in legal system, then we have a person as a mother and a person as a fetus, two persons who seem to be on the same level. So not only the abortion is the problem, but such abnormalities as ectopic pregnancy, for example. Yes, what then? That's why I believe that talking about values or the moral status of different beings is more helpful, because it shows a wider variety of problems that may occur and give possibilities to overcome those problems.
Right. Also, touching upon this issue of infanticide, which many people consider to be absolutely abhorrent, and they don't even want to, think any thought on the matter. It strikes me that it isn't so obvious that infanticide is such a extremely abhorrent practice. If, for example, in certain conditions, of course, where the baby which was just born has certain conditions, which basically you can, with high probability, say that it's going to suffer for the next few days, or maybe just a week or a few weeks, even if we, use all of our machinery and medical aids that we can put into that situation. It seems to me that in some of these situations, it could be a great mercy on our part to basically end the life of that child. That seems to me right. But Professor Peter, could you please comment on that?
Yes, that's something that I have defended, or at least to put it more precisely, I've defended the right of parents to make that decision. I don't want to be in a position of saying infants with this particular condition should not live and those with some other condition should live, because I think there are a lot of factors that come into that decision, including the desires of the parents. Do they want to do their very best to give this child a good life, despite a rather difficult prognosis because of some severe disability or illness that the child is born with? Do they have the ability to do that and the resources to do that? All of those things might be relevant. And so I think the parents ought to be the ones to make that decision. They're the ones who are going to most be affected by whether their infant with a severe condition lives or dies. So I think that they should have that option. That's my position, that because the status of an infant in this respect is somewhat different from that of an older adult who can make choices about their life, I think the parents are the ones who should decide in these difficult cases. Now, a lot of people think that that's somehow a very radical position, very different from what society does. But in fact, if you go to an intensive care unit for newborn infants in any major hospital, I'm sure you could do this in Warsaw or in Łódź, and you talk to the directors of those intensive care units and ask them, do you sometimes withdraw the respirator from a child who has a severe disability, and knowing that without a respirator the child will die? I'm sure that they will tell you, yes, sometimes we do that. They may say we consult with the parents. I hope they do consult with the parents, and we seek the parents' views. But you know, that's always done, and I think that that is really equivalent to ending the baby's life by some other means if the baby doesn't in fact need a respirator but has exactly the same condition that would justify the parents in withdrawing the respirator.
Right. Dr. Katarzyna, now I want to ask you a question which seems most difficult to me. When I find myself wondering whether my views make sense here, typically it's this type of consideration, right? So it's a sort of Ben Shapiro style reductio ad absurdum, which basically we just take away all of the capacities which we named as having some relevance or being the most important, and then we ask a question about the moral status of that. So let us imagine a man who lost consciousness due to an accident, right? And but not permanently. He is in a coma, and we can predict how long he is going to be in that coma, and it's exactly 9 months. And during this time, he isn't going to feel any pain at all. He's not going to be aware of anything, so no pain there. Further, let us stipulate, this is getting quite complex, but let us stipulate that he isn't going to have any memories when he wakes up, and nor is there going to be any family member to remind him of his past goals, the goals he used to have. And so when he wakes up, if he does, he's going to have to rediscover, figure out from scratch what his goals really are. They might be different ones, by the way, but yeah. And so when I think about such scenarios, it strikes me that killing that person, it is a person, would be on a par with killing any other adult. And now the question is there some morally relevant difference between the two cases, the abortion case, the case of the fetus, and the man in a coma? Basically, the question is, what is true of the fetus, which, if true of the man, would make it permissible that we terminate his life, basically. And also, I thought that maybe there's a different answer to this depending on whether you're a preference utilitarian or a hedonistic utilitarian. Not sure if that's right, by the way. But yeah, so what's your approach to these types of thought experiments? Are they like contrived and a bit funny, or because I really worry that there might be something here? I mean, what's your take on such a thought experiment?
Yeah, we philosophers love them.
They do.
Yes. So, of course, there is a limit to how much you can draw from such thought experiments. But I do think that they show certain intuitions, yes. And it's important to think, to check whether those intuitions have any real value or they can be disputed, right? The first thing I would believe is that this person was before, yes, so it's not like a fetus that comes into existence and doesn't have this past. Of course, as you said, the past is gone, yes. So Peter might say, for example, that the person he was has already died. But as a hedonist, I would believe that if the body is working, and we can hope that he will wake up from the coma, so let's say like from a long dream, then the person could have a good life. If it was the case, then why not to let the person live? And now, for me, a similar situation is with the fetus and with an unborn baby. The question is not whether the fetus has any value, because it has. The question is whether preferences or desires or the life of the mother is more important, so is more valuable than that of the fetus. And in the example you gave, I can't see the problem. Yes, so I can't see why not to let the person live if he could have a happy life after coming out of the coma.
I mean, I suppose that resources are still being put in place. I mean, no person can just survive 9 months in a coma without our support, right? So some resources are going in there, but it's just spread out over the whole nation. Let's say it's, you know, in a regular hospital. And in the abortion case, it's just focused on one person who's sort of forced to bear this on her own. So that would be right, I think.
To use this way of thinking, then I think that raising a child takes a lot of money and effort as well.
Oh, right. Yes, of course.
Yes, so if you can have this adult, then maybe it's better than to have a new person, a new child that you need to teach and so on in order to get to the level where he or she can decide upon their own lives.
Yes. Just thinking about this issue for a second. So it seems to me that appealing to him having a good life in the future, like there's still a life in front of him, this can be equally applied to the fetus, right? So you cannot go here, it seems to me. We rather would need to focus on, I mean, taking this line, on the pleasurable and displeasurable, let's say, the suffering of the mother and the costs that she has to basically put in to that situation. That's the most important to you in this thought experiment. Would you say so?
Yes, I believe so. We should compare. Yes, so we should compare the interests of the mother and the interests of the fetus. And maybe even the interest of future non-existent yet generations. Yes, that's the population problem, and how many people we should bring about into existence, for example.
Yes, that's definitely right. Yeah, I'm still not sure about this.
Peter, what do you think?
So I thought I largely agree with your responses, Katarzyna. I think that, but you know, perhaps disagreeing with what you said in introducing the example, Lucas, I don't really agree that this person who has to have 9 months in a coma and will emerge from that without any psychological continuity with his past, I don't think that he has the same rights to continue to live, if we are talking in terms of rights, that is, as you or I or Katarzyna has. I do think that there's something very different here because, you know, well, firstly, as I said, you know, if one of us is killed, that will terrify others. That's much less likely if you describe this very rare kind of case. But, you know, also just in terms of living our own life, we want to have that security that we will be able to continue and fulfill our projects. And that matters to us. And we're troubled by the suggestion that in some way that could be interrupted. But this man that you're talking about, those projects have been interrupted. In fact, they can no longer be continued as that person's projects. And in fact, you could ask the question, is it the same person? Right? So after 9 months, he comes out of the coma. He looks the same. He has the same physical body, but he has no memories of who he was. And you know, maybe he's somewhat different in a variety of desires. You know, coming into existence at the age of 40 or whatever would be you'd be quite a different kind of person and personality. So you could argue that this is really bringing a new person into existence, that it's not the same person. And the people who knew the person before the accident might well say, you know, that's not Paul or whoever it was who I knew. Right. This is someone else now. I've lost this friend of mine, Paul, with whom we shared all those memories about our times together before. And that's over. So I do think, you know, that there's some difference in this case, and that, you know, you talked about resources. If society were to say, we're very short of scarce medical resources, the bed that this person has to be on and the machines that have to keep these people alive could save the lives of other people who want to go on living and who will be the same person when they emerge. I think it would be reasonable to say, okay, well, we'll turn the respirator off here or whatever the machinery is, and we'll give it to somebody else who will be the same person and will want to go on living as the same person.
Dr. Katarzyna?
That's a bit different case, yes, because as I understood, you constructed this experiment to see whether we can compare the status of the person with the status of a fetus, right? While you were talking, Peter, I thought that for a hedonist, it shouldn't really, a hedonist shouldn't mind whether it's an old person or a new person in that respect, because it's just a pleasure holder. Right?
You could say that, but then the same point can apply to the fetus, right? Suppose the pregnant woman says, it's not really convenient for me to have a baby now. I'm at an important point in my career where I don't want to be interrupted by having to look after a baby. So I'm going to terminate this pregnancy, but I'm a fertile woman and my husband has normal fertility. So I will have a child maybe in 5 years when I've achieved this level in my career where I feel I can comfortably do that. So, you know, the same point would apply, right, for a hedonist. The child who will be born in 5 years makes up for the loss of the happy life of the fetus who dies when the pregnancy is terminated. And maybe has a happier life because it has a mother who is more settled and doesn't resent having had to give up her career.
Exactly. But if so, then that's the reason to terminate the pregnancy, right? So it's not the same situation, because we can predict that if I give birth to a child that I don't want now, the child will have a miserable life than later.
Right.
We don't know.
Yes, probably.
Predict.
Thank you for that. That definitely gave me a better idea.
I will just add that some things are on more, you know, intuitive, cultural level, like we all feel, yes, under our skin that we don't want doctors to end our lives in hospitals if we are in coma after an accident, yes, even if I don't remember anything from my past life and so on, yes. So it all, it's a strong push. It's a strong reason for us to argue for saving somebody like that.
Right. Professor Singer, I'd like to ask you a question about financial abortion, sometimes called male abortion. So the idea is that the biological father, or the father-to-be, if you prefer, should have the right to opt out of any rights, privileges, and responsibilities toward the child. So the liberal side sometimes says that in the abortion debate that the woman really should be entitled to have her own say on the matter. She should be able to freely decide on whether she wants to bear the consequences of becoming pregnant or not. And as a matter of I mean, I'm not trying to force you to accept that view, but if we do accept it, then it seems that as a matter of consistency, we might want to say that about the man, about the father-to-be. Should we put in place laws that would make sure that the man has such an option? If his view is that if it were my decision, I would have the fetus aborted. Is that a good idea or a bad one?
If the implication of that idea is that if the man wants the fetus to be aborted, the woman has to be compelled to do that. No, it's not that idea.
The idea is that he denies any privileges, like meeting the child knowing that he is his father. and any responsibilities in the economic sort of sphere. So he won't be supporting the mother with any money for throughout the development of the child, and when he goes to school, he won't be paying any money for him to just sustain him and so on.
So I think that depends on the circumstances of the pregnancy, really. Imagine, for example, that the woman wanted to have sex with this man and said, don't worry, I'm on the pill. But in fact, she wasn't on the pill, and she really wanted to create a child and thought that this man would be a good biological father for the child. So I think in that case, yes, perhaps the man doesn't have responsibility. He had no intention of creating a child, no reasonable foreknowledge that the sexual act would create the child. And I think that's something that's relevant to whether he has a responsibility to pay for the upbringing of the child. So, he could make that clear. And if he made that clear at an early stage of the pregnancy and the woman wasn't prepared to have a child under those circumstances, then she could have the option of terminating it, at least in a country where the law allows that. It may not be the case in Poland. But so I think there are some circumstances in which a man does not have that financial responsibility. But if he goes into this either knowing that a child may be conceived from this act without reasonable assurances that it won't happen, then I think he does bear some of the responsibility for creating the child and some of the financial responsibility as well.
Maybe let's take a more complex case. So let's say it's just a regular boyfriend and girlfriend, and they're having sex, and maybe they're a bit clumsy with using contraceptives, and due to an accident, there's a pregnancy there. The woman has become pregnant, and after some reflection, she didn't have this in mind previously, but now she thinks that it's better. Maybe she's convinced by some pro-life arguments or something. So now she's convinced that it would be bad to terminate that pregnancy. But the father has a different opinion, right? The father to be. Because you sometimes say such sentences as, maybe it's the wrong point in her career. Couldn't the man say the same? It's the wrong point in my career. I want to develop as an entrepreneur, as a businessman or something. And it's really not the right time for me. I mean,
so I want to invest my capital in my business rather than pay for the child to have an education. That seems a very callous thing to say.
It does.
I would not regard that as a good person. But for those who want to talk in terms of rights, does the man have a right to withdraw from the sort of fatherly role of the child on that basis? I can see that in a rights term, you might say that he has a right to do so, but I still think that it's a bad thing to do. Obviously, children, I think, generally benefit from having fathers who have a role in their lives, and certainly women who have to bring up children, unless they are of wealthy means, would certainly have a benefit in financial assistance from the father. So generally, I think that ought to be provided, and it's reasonable for laws to provide that in normal circumstances.
Dr. Katarzyna, would you like to add something to that?
I'm just smiling because I have two friends who are sex educators. Yes, and they always repeat to their students, to the young people, remember, sex can always end up with a pregnancy. So you should always think that sexual intercourse may result in a pregnancy, in a child. So be prepared.
Right. Okay, and now I'd like to ask you, Dr. Katarzyna, a question about protesting in COVID times. So that strikes me as a problem which is relevant today. So first of all, it seems that the concern for the health of people at risk of COVID-19 should compel us to stay at home and minimize our real-life meetings, especially when we are aware that the infections are on the rise. More and more people are becoming falling ill with COVID-19. And it also seems, on the other side of the equation, that some political changes like the 2020 ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland, call for a protest, right? And refraining from voicing our opinion on the law that they have just introduced would be basically admitting defeat and denying ourselves this ability to make a positive political change. It definitely does have some force. Absent any coronavirus, we would definitely go and protest, right? So the positive political change has to be counted in as, because of course the law which was introduced in Poland predictably has this consequence of bringing about suffering, right? That's my view, at least. I mean, that's definitely a reasonable view, I would say. There's these two forces pulling in opposite directions, and I think that in the upcoming year we might need to face, and some other countries might need to face this consequence as well. So what should be the utilitarians' thinking on this matter? How should we actually decide? Because I was in that dilemma. I'm sure you were too. And I decided to go and protest, but I wasn't happy about it. I mean, in the sense that I was perfectly aware that this could cause infections and bring about some deaths of people, right? It's real life consequences. So how do you approach this sort of problem?
That's a dramatic choice, isn't it? And I protested as well, and I worried as well. So now the question is how to compare things that we can get from protesting on the long run, and what would be the results, the short-term results of our actions. And of course, we can't really know what we are seeing now in Poland. I guess is the true worry about the changing of the democratic system, of the law in many cases, not only in abortion, but also in our law constitution and so on. We still believe that protesting is what is left for us, yes? So it's not only the power of the protest, but it's also the belief what I can do under certain circumstances, yes? How I can have an impact on politics, which is really important for a good life, for example, for each of us, right? To believe that you can have any influence, and protests then are really important. Of course, I wore a mask. I tried to keep some distance from people. I didn't see my mother or my grandma straight away, so I would not pass the virus to them. I tried to be as careful as possible, and I know many of my friends did as well. But in general, I believe that we protested too short, and the influence was too little. Of course, politicians used that, yes, very well. They knew.
Of course.
They spoke to us in this way, yes. So they put the blame on the protesters.
I'm sad to say
that the situation will get better, and then we will be able to protest, and that we will do so with the lighter hearts and strength.
Right, definitely. By the way, to anybody from outside of Poland, we have a sort of propaganda television. The national television is a sort of only takes the side of the ruling party, and at that moment they were constantly like live feeding information that this is so wrong, you shouldn't go out because you're going to, infect somebody, young people will meet with older, and then they were going to pass the coronavirus. And I was sad to say that that was pretty much accurate. I mean, they knew what they were doing, right? They actually, I'm pretty sure that this was planned, and this was supposed to be an argument for us to stay. But then again, there's this priority of actually making sure that our law doesn't sort of bend onto the needs of a a Catholic worldview. There's people in Poland who actually don't share that view. Professor Peter, would you have some additional comments on that issue?
Well, I can certainly say that I'm glad I was not put in that situation. I had to choose between risking spreading the virus or appearing to acquiesce in a very restrictive law that did not represent the interests of the women who were needing to have control of their pregnancy. So I think it's difficult. I think, as Katarzyna said, it's important to show that you're doing your very best to avoid spreading the virus when you do protest, perhaps to find ways of protesting that allow people to keep at a distance from each other.
Right.
But certainly, the right for political protest is important, and in a way, it's unscrupulous of governments to bring in laws knowing that this is a particular time when people opposed to them cannot or at least can be criticized if they do protest.
Right.
That I don't know to what extent they orchestrated the timing that way. I don't know enough about how it was done, but if that happened, then it's a very cynical exercise.
One of many.
One of many cynical exercises.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, and on that rather sad note, I'd like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak with you. I definitely learned a lot. Thank you for that. I'd like to give you this chance to plug any books, any materials that you would like to recommend to my audience. I definitely value you as thinkers, so I think anything you recommend, I'm willing to sign my name under that as well.
Thank you. Well, you did kindly mention some of the books that Katarzyna and I have written together at the start. Particularly, let me reiterate, I think our little introduction to utilitarianism in the Oxford series of very short introductions on utilitarianism. It's a very short book. It's 100 pages or so. There isn't a Polish version of it, I'm sorry to say, but anybody who can read some English will not have too much difficulty in reading it in a single evening. And I think it is a good introduction to utilitarianism and to the foundations of some of the ideas that we have both been expressing.
And maybe to cheer us up a little bit now after this rather sad conclusion, in this book I've learned that you've dined with none other than Jeremy Bentham.
Yes.
Dr. Katarzyna, could you please say a few words about that?
Yeah, Jeremy Bentham dedicated his body after his death to medical experiments. That was a good thing to do at that time. There were very few bodies for such experiments. After that was done, his body was
mummified, I think is the correct word. It was preserved, like the Egyptian mummies in a way.
Yes, and dressed. The mask was put on his face, and it was put into a big glass box. And now it's at the University of London.
Yes, University College London.
A few years ago, Peter and I were at the Mill Conference, and there was dinner. And Jerry was brought.
Wheeled out in the glass box.
Exactly, and he dined with him. Yes.
We have to say he didn't contribute very much to the conversation. Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yeah.
That would have been wonderful if he could have.
Yeah. On that note, I want to thank you. Hopefully, we'll get an opportunity to repeat that. Thank you a lot, and until next time, hopefully.
Thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation.